She was only 6, far too young to carry a world already broken. Yet, there she stood, her tiny arms trembling as she balanced her baby brother on her back, dragging a mop across the kitchen floor like it was the last shield she had left. No neighbors knocked. No voices of comfort broke the silence. But that silence cracked open the moment a soldier turned his key, pushed open his front door, then froze. This was not the homecoming Mason Hale had clung to through endless nights overseas. It wasn't balloons or laughter. It was a desperate cry for help, carved into the raw hands of a child and painted on her tear-streaked cheeks. And yet, hope never walks alone. At Mason's side stood Scout, his German shepherd, a shadow of loyalty and steel. The dog's body stiffened, ears pricked, as if he, too, understood this moment would change everything. Cedar Falls stretched out behind Mason like a painting of autumn copper and tired porches. He had driven in with dreams of Lily running down the steps, shouting, "Daddy!" But reality greeted him with silence. The porch light was dead, its bulb burned out long ago. Scout let out a low whine as Mason stepped forward, boots thudding against wood that felt more hollow than solid. He opened the door, and the world tilted. Inside, Lily stood in the dim living room. Her hair was uneven, hacked short with kitchen scissors. Her faded pink shirt hung loose over her bird-like shoulders. She was barefoot, mopping with a tool nearly twice her size, while on her back, baby Max clung to her with a sling made from an old bedsheet. His cheeks were fever-flushed, eyes wide and blinking in the half-light. "Daddy!" The word cracked from her throat, fragile as glass. Mason's breath caught. Every mile of war he had walked, every scar he carried, none of it compared to this sight. His little girl, not playing, not laughing, but holding the weight of survival on her back. He felt something inside him splinter. Scout pressed forward, standing like a barrier between the children and the shadows of the house. And then, the unexpected twist. From the corner of the kitchen, the faint scrape of a chair. Mason's instincts flared. He hadn't noticed it at first, too blinded by the sight of his children. But now, a figure stirred in the darkness, someone who should not have been there. The stranger froze at the sight of Mason, of Scout's amber eyes locked on him, of Lily clutching her mop like a sword she was too small to wield. The soldier's homecoming had just turned into a battlefield. The mop clattered to the floor. For a heartbeat, her eyes shone with joy, but then it dimmed into confusion and the faint shadow of fear. Because children learn quickly when their world is fragile. Scout moved before Mason could. The dog trotted forward, nose pressed into Lily's stomach, tail wagging low and steady. He gave a deep sigh, the kind of dog sound that carries centuries of reassurance. Max squealed, reaching tiny hands toward the dog's ears. Mason dropped his duffel and knelt. "Sweetheart," he whispered, gathering Lily into one arm while steadying Max with the other. The smell of bleach and sour milk filled his lungs. "What's going on? Why are you doing this?" Lily shifted, her raw little hands hidden behind her back. Mason caught them and nearly cursed aloud. The skin of her palms was pink and peeling, crescent-shaped blisters along her knuckles. "Who told you to do this?" Her. The voice was barely air. "Miss Shannon went out for a while. She said the floors look poor if they're sticky. She said I should make them shiny." Mason clenched his jaw. Shannon Pike, the downstairs neighbor who had agreed to look in on the kids when he couldn't be home yet, was supposed to provide care, not abandon them. Shannon was a woman in her early 40s, tall but thin, from years of cheap cigarettes and barroom suppers. Her auburn hair was usually tied high, though loose strands always fell into her freckled face. She carried herself with a mix of sass and weariness, her humor sharp, but often laced with bitterness. Mason had met her once before leaving. She had insisted she was good with kids. He'd had no choice but to trust her for a few days until he returned. And here was the result. "Where is she now?" Mason asked, though the answer sat heavy in his chest already. Lily's lip trembled. She said, "The bar. She goes there sometimes. She said she'd be right back." Scout barked, once, sharp, and padded into the kitchen. Mason followed, still carrying Max and holding Lily's small hand. The dog sat stiffly at the cabinet under the sink, nose pressed to the seam. Mason crouched, opened it, and cursed under his breath. Mold crept along the wood in black flecks, a damp rot spreading like bruises. The sink counter held only a single bottle of water and an empty formula can. Mason pulled his phone from in his pocket. He snapped pictures of the floor, the children, the mold, the empty shelves. His hands shook, but not with fear. With the discipline of a man documenting evidence, every moment mattered. He dialed Shannon's number. The call rang twice before she answered, her voice bright with forced cheer. "Hey Mason, you're back early, huh? I was just... Come back now." His tone cut like steel. There was silence, then a nervous laugh. "Oh, don't be so stiff. I only stepped out for a now." Mason repeated, "Or I call the sheriff." When he hung up, he crouched again before Lily. "You're not to touch that mop again. Do you hear me? That's Daddy's job, and Scout's job is to keep you safe." Lily nodded, but the tears that slipped down her cheeks betrayed more than obedience. She clung to his sleeve like a lifeline. Max gurgled against Mason's chest, reaching for Scout, who pressed close with his warm flank like a living wall. Mason set the children on the couch, fetched the last bottle of water, and poured it carefully into a sippy cup for Lily and a small bottle for Max. Then he microwaved a can of soup from his duffel, military rations stashed for emergencies. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and it filled the silence with a smell of chicken broth instead of mildew. When Shannon finally stumbled back, Scout's growl rolled through the apartment like distant thunder. Mason stood at the doorway, jaw set, phone, camera raised. Shannon froze, half-smile dying as she took in the scene. Children. Fed, pictures taken, the soldier's eyes unblinking. "This ends tonight, Mason," said softly, each word a nail hammered into a coffin. Scout stepped forward, his amber gaze locking on Shannon, his tail still, his body coiled like a sentinel, who had finally claimed his post, and for the first time in a long while, the little house on Birch Street felt like it belonged to its rightful defenders, a father, 2 children, and a dog who refused to let them suffer in silence again. The next morning, pale sunlight spread thin across Birch Street, carrying with it the damp smell of leaves and chimney smoke. Mason Hale laced up his boots, slung Max into a carrier against his chest, and took Lily by the hand. Scout padded beside them, his amber eyes watchful, tail steady as a metronome. Today, the soldier's first mission at home was not about unpacking boxes or fixing walls. It was about answers. The Cedar Falls community clinic sat on the corner of Main and Willow, its old brick walls softened by years of ivy and chipped paint. Inside, the smell of antiseptic mingled with lavender air freshener, a half-hearted attempt to soothe nervous families. Nurse Robin Harper was the first to greet them. Robin was in her early 52nds, short and plump, with cheeks that glowed up naturally pink, as though she carried a constant blush of kindness. Her curly brown hair was peppered with gray, and her round glasses slid down her nose every time she laughed, which was often. She had worked in the clinic for over 20 years, her voice always carrying a practical warmth, the kind of voice that made children trust her, even when needles were involved. "Oh heavens, look at these little ones," Robin said, crouching so Lily could see her face. "And this handsome pup. What's his name?" "Scout," Lily whispered, hiding, her bandaged hands behind her back. "Scout," Robin repeated, giving the dog a gentle nod. "He looks like the sort that doesn't miss much." Mason appreciated her tone. No pity, no oversweetness, just genuine kindness. He explained the situation quickly. The mop, the raw hands, the late night, absence of Shannon. Robin's brows knit into a frown as she led them back to an exam room. Dr. Marianne Keller soon entered, and her presence changed the air immediately. Marianne was in her mid-40s, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones softened by gentle eyes. Her long dark hair was tied neatly in a braid that fell over one shoulder, and she wore minimal makeup, her natural complexion olive-toned and glowing with health. Marianne was known around Cedar Falls as someone with no tolerance for nonsense, and yet infinite patience for children. A scar along her left forearm hinted at a car accident years ago. Locals said she had been trapped and still bears the reminder. Since then, she carried a fierce protectiveness for anyone vulnerable. She examined Lily with deliberate care, her hands steady and professional. "These are friction, blisters and mild chemical burns from bleach," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And she's clearly exhausted. Her body weight is slightly under where it should be for her age. She needs rest, hydration, and no more cleaning. Chemicals. Period." Max fussed, squirming in Mason's arms, and Marianne placed a cool stethoscope against his chest. "He's tired but fine," she concluded. "No serious issues, though. He could use more consistent formula. Babies this age need stability." Mason exhaled, a mixture of guilt and relief flooding through him. He had survived combat zones, but this This was the battle that knifed deepest. Dr. Keller pulled a notepad from her coat. I'm required to file a report with Child Protective Services, she said. This is not about punishing you, Mr. Hale. You did the right thing bringing them here immediately, but someone left them unattended. That can't happen again. I understand, Mason replied. His voice carried the steadiness of a soldier, acknowledging an order. After the visit, they stopped at Hanson's Market. Mason needed essentials, but Scout had his own agenda. As soon as the sliding doors opened, the dog trotted confidently down the aisles, ignoring the curious stares of shoppers. He stopped in front of the baby aisle, nose pressed to shelves stacked with powdered formula, his tail wagging once. Mason gave a small chuckle, despite himself. Guess he knows priorities, Mason said, grabbing 3 cans. Scout then marched 2 aisles over and sat before the gallon jugs of spring water, amber eyes glinting with determination. A teenage clerk in a red apron paused, half amused, half confused. Sir, your dog's, shopping. He's smarter than most people I know, Mason said. Better get me 6 of those. Lily giggled for the first time since Mason's return, a small sound like glass chimes. Max reached a fist toward Scout's ear, squealing. For a moment, the heaviness lifted. Back at the house, the groceries, barely set aside. A sharp knock rattled the door. Mason opened it to find Officer Dana Ruiz on the porch. Dana was, in her late 30s, of Hispanic heritage, with a tall, athletic build that spoke of daily runs and long patrol shifts. Her black hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her uniform looked pressed even after hours of wear. Her face was striking strong jawline, high cheekbones, and eyes the color of dark coffee that missed nothing. There was a firmness to her, but beneath it, a compassion that revealed itself in the smallest tilt of her smile. Mr. Hale, she said, holding a clipboard. We received a call regarding possible child neglect here last night. I need to speak with you. Mason stood straighter, the reflex of a man used to answering to authority. Come in, officer. You'll want to see this. Scout stepped back, but didn't take his eyes off her, reading her intent with canine precision. Dana knelt slightly, extended a hand, and let Scout sniff. Service trained? She asked. More. Loyal than most soldiers? Mason replied. Inside, Mason showed her the photos he had taken. Lily's blistered hands, the mold under the sink, the empty shelves. Dana's brows drew together as she jotted notes. You've been back less than 24 hours, and this is what you walked into. Yes, ma'am. Where's Shannon Pike now? Mason's jaw tightened. Downstairs. I told her to come back last night. She left the children alone to go to a bar. Dana sighed, her pen tapping against the clipboard. I'll be blunt. That's neglect. We'll file an incident report. She'll likely be removed from any list of approved sitters in the county. She glanced at Lily, who was curled on the cars, couch stroking Scout's fur, and her voice softened. But the children look safe with you. CPS will draft what we call a safety plan. It's a set of rules. No heavy chores for your daughter, structured care for the baby, regular check-ins from a caseworker. It protects you as much as them. Mason nodded. Whatever keeps them safe. Dana finished writing, then looked him in the eye. You're a soldier, right? Think of this, like a field manual. Stick to the plan, document everything, and no one can question you. Understood? Yes, officer. She left him with a copy of the preliminary report, the words stark in black ink. As the patrol car pulled away, Mason sat heavily at the table, paper in his hands. Lily climbed into his lap, Max on his knee, Scout pressed against his boots. The weight of war had been rifles and dust and silence. The weight of home was rules, safety plans, and the promise he whispered into his daughter's hair. No more battles for you, sweetheart. I'll fight them all. The following afternoon, the air in Cedar Falls turned crisp and brittle, as if winter had begun to lean its weight against the mountains. Mason Hale was fixing a pot of oatmeal for Lily, while Max crawled across the living room rug, his babbles filling the air like little sparks of life. Scout lay near the door, head on his paws, his ears flicking at every distant sound. It had been less than 48 hours since Mason returned, and yet it already felt like a war zone of paperwork, responsibilities, and vigilance. The safety plan from CPS was taped to the refrigerator like a set of battlefield orders. No heavy chores for Lily, scheduled feedings for Max, weekly visits. Mason had faced commanding officers with fewer rules. Still, he was determined. Rules could be followed as long as they meant protection. but another front was about to open. A sharp, pounding rattled the front door, too aggressive to be a neighbor's knock. Scout sprang to his feet, body taut, ears pointed, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Mason set down the spoon, moved quietly to the door, and opened it a cautious crack. Carl Benton stood on the porch. Carl was in his late 52s, a broad man with thick forearms that spoke of years working in construction before he turned to property management. His belly pressed against his flannel shirt, and his thinning blonde gray hair was slicked back with cheap gel. A scraggly beard clung to his chin, the kind that never looked intentional, but more like neglect. His eyes were pale blue, sharp, but impatient. The eyes of a man who expected the world to move when he barked. Miller Carl boomed. "Hail, Mason," corrected evenly, opening the door wider but planting himself firm. "Whatever. You're behind on rent and there's been too much racket here. Neighbors complained. I don't want troublemakers. If I don't get payment in quiet, I'll just change the locks. End of story. End of Vizzy." Scout moved forward, standing. Between Mason and the threshold, teeth bared just enough to gleam. The dog didn't lunge, but his message was clear. No one crossed that door uninvited. Lily peeked around the corner, her small face tightening with worry. Mason's voice dropped low, calm, but edged with steel. "State law doesn't allow you to change locks without due process. I know my rights, Mr. Benton." He reached for his phone, raised it so the camera lens faced Carl, and tapped record. "You're on video. Say that again." Carl's face flushed red. He shifted from one foot to another, caught between bluster and the sharp awareness of legal boundaries. "Fine, but don't think I won't evict you legally. Soldiers think they can come back, stomp around like heroes. I run this property, not you." Mason didn't flinch. "You'll hear from my lawyer." Carl sneered, muttered something under his breath, and stomped off down the porch. Scout followed him with his gaze, growl, tapering only when the man's truck roared down the street. The moment the door shut, Mason ended the video, recording, and saved it carefully. He sat at the kitchen table, the weight of exhaustion pressing into his shoulders. Combat had taught him never to underestimate enemies, no matter how small they appeared. Carl wasn't armed with rifles. He was armed with property rights and the threat of homelessness, which in some ways was far more dangerous to a family. He dialed a number scrolled on a pamphlet he had picked up at the VA office months ago. Within 2 rings, a warm but steady voice answered. "Tanner Law Offices, this is Tanner speaking." Tanner Price was in his early 42s, a community lawyer known across Cedar Falls for taking cases others ignored. He had a lean build, sharp suits, always slightly wrinkled, as though he never stopped moving. His black hair was streaked with early silver at the temples, his jaw perpetually shadowed by stubble. Years earlier, his younger brother had been evicted unfairly, forcing their family into weeks of couch surfing. Since then, Tanner had carried a burning commitment to defend tenants, especially veterans. His tone was brisk but empathetic, a man who balanced sarcasm with sincerity. Mason explained the landlord's threat, the video recording, and his situation with the children. Tanner listened, without interrupting. "You did right recording him," Tanner finally said. "That's intimidation, plain and simple. He can't change locks without court order. We'll file for a tenant protection notice first thing tomorrow. I'll also loop in veteran affairs. They've got emergency housing assistance if he tries to push you out before it's resolved." "Appreciate it," Mason said. Tanner chuckled softly. "Don't thank me. Yet. This Carl Benton is a known headache. But he won't know what to do when he finds out you've got legal backup. Text me the video. I'll draft a preliminary complaint tonight." For the first time that day, Mason felt the faintest crack of relief. By late afternoon, a knock at the door startled him again, though this time it was softer, measured. Scout didn't growl, just stood poised, waiting. Mason opened the door to find a caseworker from CPS, a woman named Sarah Lindholm. Sarah was in her late 22s, tall and slender, with long strawberry blonde hair pulled into a neat ponytail. Her skin was fair, dotted with freckles across her nose, and her green eyes carried a constant note of alertness, as if always scanning for hidden truths. She dressed plainly in a gray cardigan and navy slacks, but carried herself with the quiet authority. People often underestimated her because of her youth, but Sarah had learned quickly. Her own childhood had been shaped by foster care after her parents' divorce spiraled into neglect. That history had carved into her a fierce drive to protect other children from the same loneliness. "Mr. Hale?" she asked, smiling briefly. "I'm Sarah with CPS. We spoke with Dr. Keller. I need to conduct a home inspection." Mason invited her in. She moved methodically, clipboard in hand, noting the taped-up safety plan, the fresh groceries, the bottles of water lined up on the counter. When she reached the sink cabinet, she crouched low, frowning at the patches of mold. "This has to be remediated," she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "Environmental safety is part of the plan. Mold can worsen respiratory issues in children." "I'll handle it," Mason replied without hesitation. Sarah studied him for a moment, then her expression softened. I can see you're trying hard. It's clear your kids are bonded to you. That's a good sign. But follow the plan. CPS will be checking in weekly." Lily tugged at Mason's sleeve. "Daddy fixed soup yesterday," she whispered to Sarah. "It was yummy." Sarah smiled warmly. "That's good to hear, sweetheart. Your dad's taking good care of you." Before leaving, Sarah handed Mason a packet with resources: local repair services, grant, programs for housing assistance, and a contact sheet for emergencies. Scout nudged her hand once, as though sensing her sincerity. She scratched behind his ears and said softly, "You're a good boy, aren't you? Keep them safe." Scout's tail thumped once in reply. That evening, after the children were asleep, Mason sat at the table again, Scout at his feet. On one side lay the CPS safety plan, its bold letters spelling out responsibilities and warnings. On the other lay Tanner's legal forms for tenant protection, the promise of a tenant protection, the looming fight with Carl Benton. It felt like facing a battle on two fronts, protecting his children from neglect, while defending their roof from greed. But he was not alone. He had Scout's watchful eyes, Tanner's legal fire, and Sarah's careful oversight. And above all, he had the image of Lily's small smile, Max's warm weight against his chest. Mason whispered into the quiet house, as though etching a vow into the walls. "No one pushes us out. No one hurts them again." Scout raised his head, ears flicking, as if to say he understood. The war wasn't overseas anymore. It was right here in Cedar Falls, and Mason Hale intended to win it. 2 days after Carl Benton's threat, Mason Hale sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold. Papers lay spread out before him. Forms from CPS, Tanner's drafted complaint, receipts from the market. Outside, the morning sun pushed through thin curtains, pale and unconvincing, as though it too was weary of the fight. Scout sat beneath the table, his head resting on Mason's boot, amber eyes fixed on his master's face. The front door creaked open, and Tanner Price stepped inside without ceremony. Tanner had that habit of entering spaces as though he'd been there all along. Tall frame hunched slightly from years of bending over case files. He wore a gray suit jacket that had lost its crispness long ago and carried a leather briefcase patched with scuffs. His stubble was darker this morning, his eyes sharp but carrying a hint of fatigue. "Drafts ready," Tanner said, dropping the briefcase on the table. He pulled out a typed document and slid it toward Mason. Formal letter of demand. "We're addressing the mold, the water leakage, and the landlord's threat. He's got 10 days to comply, or we report to the county housing inspector." Mason read the bold header. Notice to repair and remedy. The language was firm, almost military in tone, Tanner's style. What if he ignores it? Mason asked. Tanner shrugged one shoulder, leaning back. Then it escalates. Inspectors, fines, even court. "Carl, Benton thrives on bullying tenants who don't know the law. But you've got two things most people don't: evidence and me." He smirked faintly. "That's usually enough." Scout thumped his tail once as, if agreeing, Mason signed where Tanner pointed. The lawyer tucked the pages neatly into an envelope. "I'll serve this by certified mail today. He can't claim ignorance later." The sound of Max babbling from the playpen interrupted their focus. Lily crouched beside her brother, stacking blocks into a crooked tower. Tanner watched them for a moment, his expression softening. "They're tougher than they look," he said. "Reminds me why I keep doing this." Later that afternoon, Mason strapped Max into the carrier again, Lily clutching his hand, Scout leading the way. They walked down toward Cedar Creek, a winding stream that cut through the heart of town. The water ran shallow, this time of year, its surface reflecting slivers of light like broken glass. Old cottonwoods lined the banks, their bare branches scratching against the wind. Scout trotted ahead confidently, nose to the ground, pausing at every fork as if to guide Mason toward some unseen destination. The dog's coat caught the sun, thick black, and tan fur that gleamed like polished leather. Passers-by often slowed to admire him, but Scout never lingered on. Strangers. His loyalty was singular, anchored to the family at his side. They reached the steps of Cedar Falls Community Church. The white wooden building had stood for nearly a century, its steeple simple but proud against the place. Sky. Inside, the scent of old wood mingled with faint candle wax. Pastor. Helen Morris met them in the entryway. Helen was in her late 60s, tall and wiry, with silver hair cropped close. Her lined face open and kind. She wore a cardigan knitted by some member of the congregation, bright teal against her plain black dress. Her hands were calloused from decades of gardening, her spirit rooted in service more than sermons. "Mason Hale," she said warmly, clasping his hand. "Welcome home, son. I heard you were back, trying to get my footing," Mason admitted. Helen glanced at Lily and Max, her expression tightening with maternal concern. These little ones need more than footing. Come. She led them to the fellowship hall, where tables were stacked with boxes from the town's food pantry. Volunteers bustled quietly, sorting cans and stacking diapers. A young man named Elijah Tall, lanky with sandy hair that kept falling into his eyes, handed Mason 2 cartons of baby formula. "We set these aside," Elijah said shilly. "Figured you'd need them more than most." Mason felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you." Helen touched his arm gently. "The church covers utility bills for families in crisis. Consider it done for this month." "Pride doesn't feed children, Mason. Let us help Scout sniff at a bag of rice," tail wagging, before settling near Lily, as if guarding the bounty. Back home, Mason taped another sheet to the refrigerator. CPS safety plan. Household schedule. Sarah Lindholm had returned that morning, with the formalized plan. The schedule was strict meals at 8 a.m., noon, and 6 p.m., nap bedtime. Structured for Max, quiet time for Lily, light chores, only. Mason to handle all heavy cleaning, repairs, and bleach use. Medical follow-up in 2 weeks at the clinic. Lily stared at the paper, sounding out the letters with a hesitant finger. "Does this mean I don't have to mop anymore?" "That's exactly what it means," Mason said, kneeling beside her. "Your job is to play, learn, and help. With little things like setting the table, nothing more." Relief flickered in her eyes, though she still looked uncertain, as if waiting for someone to contradict it. That evening, Officer Dana Ruiz stopped by again, her uniform crisp even after a long day. She explained calmly that Shannon Pike had been officially removed from the county's child care roster. "She's barred from babysitting in any licensed capacity," Dana said, "and we've issued a warning. If she approaches the children again without your consent, call us immediately. There's potential for misdemeanor charges if she violates the order." Mason felt tension ease from his chest. The thought of Shannon reappearing, of Lily shrinking back into fear, had haunted him. Now, at least that. The door was closed. Dana crouched briefly to stroke Scout's fur. "Good guard dog," she murmured. "He doesn't miss much. He saved us more than once already," Mason replied. After Dana left, the house fell into quiet. Max slept in his crib, cheeks flushed with baby dreams. Lily curled on the couch with a book of fairy tales. Mason sat at the table once more, Scout's head heavy against his knee. On one side of the table lay Tanner's letter, ready to confront Carl Benton. On the other lay Helen's donation receipt, proof of the community's extended hand. Between legal pressure and quiet grace, Mason realized, survival didn't always come from sheer grit. Sometimes it came from people, willing to stand beside you. He brushed his hand across Scout's fur and whispered, "We'll get through this." Scout's tail thumped once, steady as a vow. The night was quiet in Cedar Falls, the kind of quiet that pressed against the windows like a heavy blanket. Inside the Hale house, the children were asleep. Max curled in his crib, his small chest rising and falling in rhythm, with the lull of dreams. Lily tucked under her quilt, her favorite stuffed rabbit pressed close to her cheek. Mason checked on them once more before stepping into the living room. Scout lay near the door, ears prick-ricked, his thick black and tan fur gleaming faintly under the lamp. He was watchful, as always, a sentry that never rested. Mason trusted Scout's instincts even more than his own. It was nearly midnight when Scout stirred suddenly. His head shot up, ears rigid, nostrils flaring. A deep growl rumbled from his chest. Mason froze, muscles tightening, with the reflexes of a soldier. Then he heard it. Faint metallic clinks followed, by hushed voices outside the door. Mason moved swiftly but silently. He flicked off the living room light, leaving only the hallway lamp glowing dimly. With one hand, he grabbed his phone. With the other, he brushed Scout's back gently, signaling the dog to stay alert but steady. Through the narrow window beside the door, Mason saw them. Carl Benton, broad frame hunched in the glow of a flashlight, and another man beside him, skinny with a toolbox in hand, a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. Carl's flannel shirt was half buttoned, his breath misting in the cold air. The skinny man, clearly a hired locksmith or handyman, fumbled nervously with a new lock cylinder. Carl hissed under his breath, "Just get it done before he notices. I'll deal with the rest." Mason flipped on the porch light in one swift motion. The sudden flood of brightness cut across Carl's face, freezing him mid-motion. The skinny man jerked, dropping a tool that clattered loudly against the porch. Scout barked ferociously, lunging toward the door, claws scraping wood. His bark was thunderous, a sound that carried the promise of teeth. Mason opened the door only a crack, phone raised, the red record light glowing. His voice was calm but sharp, honed from years of command. "Step away from my door, Carl. You're being recorded." Carl's face flushed. "You're behind, Hale. I'm securing my property perfectly within my rights." "You're lying," Mason shot back. "It's midnight. You brought a stranger to break into my home with 2 children inside. This is illegal lock changing, an attempted unlawful entry." He dialed 911 on speaker. The operator's voice filled the night air. 911. "What's your emergency?" "This is Sergeant Mason Hale," he said evenly. "Address is 324 Willow Lane, Cedar Falls. My landlord is attempting an illegal lock change right now. My children are asleep inside. Send officers immediately." The operator. "Confirm dispatch," Carl muttered under his breath. The handyman already stepping backward, toolbox clutched, nervously. Minutes stretched taut as a wire. Mason kept recording, Scout, and continued barking. Though he quieted once, Mason rested a firm hand on his back. Carl paced, muttering about tenants who think they know the law. Then red and blue lights flashed down the street. A patrol car pulled up, headlights cutting across the yard. Out stepped Officer Dana Ruiz. Dana's presence was steady as stone. Tonight she wore her duty jacket zipped high, her dark hair tucked beneath her cap. Her sharp brown eyes swept the scene, catching every detail. Carl at the door, the locksmith frozen by the truck. Mason calm with his phone raised, Scout standing guard. "What's going on here?" Dana's voice cut through the tension. Carl blustered first. "Officer, I'm the landlord. He's late on rent. I have the right to secure the property." Dana's gaze hardened. "At midnight with a stranger. That's not securing property, Mr. Benton. That's unlawful entry." She pulled a notepad, her tone crisp. "State law prohibits landlords from changing locks or entering without court order. You know this. You're trespassing, and you've disrupted a household with minors. You're inside." Mason added, "Everything's recorded. My kids are asleep safely. Lights on, house secure." Dana nodded at him. "You did the right thing calling in." Turning back to Carl, she said sharply, "You'll cease this immediately. I'll be filing a full incident report. If you attempt this again, you may face criminal charges." The handyman raised both hands nervously. "Hey, I was just hired. I didn't know it was like this. Get in your truck and leave," Dana ordered. "Now?" He obeyed without hesitation, toolbox rattling as he fled. Carl lingered, face twisted with rage. But Dana stepped closer, her hand resting deliberately near her belt. "Do you really want me to book you tonight?" Carl spat on the ground, muttered curses, and stomped off to his truck. Tires screeched as he sped away into the night. Dana exhaled, the night air steaming around her. She turned to Mason. "You handled this exactly right. Lights on, video evidence, kids asleep safely that shows compliance with the CPS plan. This works in your favor." Mason gave a tight nod. "I don't want to give them any reason to doubt me." "They won't," Dana assured him. She scribbled, "Notes. I'll include in my report that you followed protocol. CPS will see this as further proof of stability." Scout, calmer now, leaned against Mason's leg, his tail swishing once, as though satisfied the danger had passed. Dana crouched briefly, scratching the dog's ear. "Good guard, dog. You've got backup." On 4 legs and 2 feet. Mason almost smiled. "That's the only reason I can sleep at all." After Dana left, Mason locked the door, slid the chain into place, and checked the children once more. Lily stirred briefly in her sleep, murmuring something about fairy tales. Max's tiny fingers gripped his blanket tighter. Mason stood in the darkened hallway. Scout pressed close to his. Sighed. Tonight had proven how quickly stability could shatter and how vigilance could protect it, he whispered. Into the quiet, they'll stay safe. As long as I breathe, they'll stay safe. Scout's low rumble of agreement filled the silence, a promise in canine language. The next morning, Mason Hale opened his front door to a sight he hadn't expected. A line of pickup trucks, vans, and even 2 bicycles leaned against the fence outside. Cedar Falls was not a large town, but word traveled fast, faster than Mason realized. Last night's confrontation had already made its way into every corner cafe and church pew, and now the community had shown up. Scout barked once, not in warning, but in excitement, tail wagging at the crowd of new scents and voices. At the head of the group stood Ethan Cross, a master electrician, in his 50 seconds. Ethan was broad-shouldered with weathered skin, the color of copper, and a thick beard stray. He had a voice, like gravel, and eyes that always carried a hint of weariness, shaped by years of climbing poles and bitter winters and storm blackouts. Mason Hale, Ethan called. Name's Ethan. Heard you've been having trouble with wiring, lights, and a whole lot more. He jerked a thumb toward his truck. Got a crew with me. Thought we'd lend a hand. Beside him was Marla Jennings, a carpenter in her 40 seconds with long blonde hair tied back under a red bandana. She was tall and wiry, her arms corded with muscle, a single scar cut across her left forearm. Earned, she said later, during a sawmill accident years ago. Mara's reputation was one of blunt honesty. Mold eats at houses, she remarked, peering at the siding, but not today. Trailing behind them came a small cluster of high school students in hoodies and sneakers, lugging buckets and mops. The leader, a boy named Ryan Delgado, wore thick glasses and had an earnest energy that made him stand out. Our shop class needed hours, he said, grinning. Might as well do something that matters. Pastor Helen Morris arrived soon after, silver hair catching the sunlight. She carried a box of light bulbs and bottled water, her cardigan slipping off one shoulder as she set the supplies on the porch. We're calling it the Porch Light Project, she explained, smiling. A promise that no child in Cedar Falls should live in the dark. Mason felt his throat tighten. He was a soldier, trained to expect betrayal or hidden motives. But here stood a half-dozen strangers and neighbors, with nothing to gain but the satisfaction of helping. Thank you, he managed. Really? Scout pressed against his knee, as though sensing Mason's overwhelmed heart. Inside, the work began. Ethan examined the breaker box, muttering under his breath. Old wires, brittle. Surprised this place hasn't sparked already. His calloused hands moved with practiced precision, replacing corroded circuits, running new lines, and installing modern outlets. Mara attacked the bathroom walls where mold had crept black and stubborn. She wore gloves and a mask, scrubbing with chemical solution, then cutting out rotted sections of drywall to replace with clean boards. Her movements were efficient, hammer blows echoing steady as a drumbeat. The students fanned out, across the rooms, scrubbing corners, sealing gaps with caulk, and repainting trim. Their laughter rang down the hallway, turning what had felt like a house of gloom into a place of warmth again. In the kitchen, Pastor Helen supervised. She directed Lily with gentle encouragement. Sweetheart, can you hand me that brush? Perfect. You've got a steady hand, Lily. Usually shy, glowed under the praise, painting the baseboards with neat strokes. Meanwhile, Max giggled on the living room floor, tossing a rattle toward Scout. The German shepherd crouched playfully, nose nudging the toy back, tail sweeping across the floor. Each giggle from Max seemed to dissolve the heaviness that had hung over the family for weeks. 2 days later, Sarah Lindholm from CPS returned for re-inspection. Sarah's auburn hair was pinned back in a bun, her glasses perched low on her nose as she took notes on a clipboard. Her pale face, usually serious, softened slightly as she walked through the freshly repaired rooms. Walls dry, no visible mold, she said aloud, ticking boxes. Electricals replaced, lighting adequate, water fixtures functional. Children observed safe, clean, and engaged. She crouched to speak directly to Lily. How are your hands feeling, Lily? Lily held them out shilly. Better. Daddy says no. More scrubbing floors. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's right, no heavy chores. Only schoolwork and play. Okay. Max gurgled from Scout's side, tugging gently at the dog's ear. Scout bore it patiently, giving the baby's cheek a slow lick. Sarah scribbled again, lips twitching and a smile. Even the dog is part of the protective environment. Her final verdict was clear. The home now meets safety requirements. She scheduled Lily's follow-up dermatology appointment and closed her folder with a firm snap. That evening, once the volunteers had packed up, Mason sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by forms. He worked methodically. A short-term rental assistance application through the county. A new work schedule drafted with the help of his VA counselor. Balancing part-time shifts at the local hardware store with childcare needs. An updated budget that factored in formula, diapers, and electricity. Scout lay by his chair, ears flicking every time a foking. The truck passed outside. Mason absently rubbed the dog's head while filling in blanks with blocky handwriting. It felt almost like the army again. Reports, schedules, logistics. But this time, the mission was not war. It was survival at home. Lily padded out of her room in pajamas, holding a book. "Daddy, can Scout listen to a story too?" Mason smiled faintly. "I think Scout would love that." They sat together on the couch. Scout stretched at their feet as Lily's small voice read aloud about a knight protecting a castle. Mason glanced at the dog and thought, "Every knight has his armor. Ours just happens to have 4 legs and a wagging tail." When night finally came, Mason stepped outside. The new porch light, bright, steady, unyielding, flooded the front yard in a warm glow. For the first time since returning to Cedar Falls, he felt the weight on his chest lift. The darkness no longer pressed in. The house no longer seemed a place of weakness. Behind him, Lily's laughter floated through the window. Scout sat beside him on the porch, gaze sweeping the street, body relaxed yet vigilant. Mason whispered, "We're getting stronger, buddy." One step at a time, Scout's tail thumped once in quiet agreement. The courthouse in Cedar Falls was a modest brick building, its columns worn by decades of wind and snow. On the morning of the hearing, Mason Hale arrived early, wearing his only suit, a plain, navy jacket, neatly pressed, though the fabric showed its years. Beside him, Lily clutched a small notebook, her cheeks pink from the cold. Max remained at home with Pastor Helen, safe and warm. Scout walked proudly at Mason's side, tail level, amber eyes alert. He wore a simple harness patched with Mason's old unit insignia, a reminder of loyalty forged in harder days. More than one passerby stopped to smile at the German Shepherd. Inside the courtroom, Judge Miriam Collier presided. She was a woman in her early 60s, with sharp cheekbones and cropped gray hair. Her robes hung heavily over her tall frame, and though her voice was steady, her eyes betrayed no tolerance for excuses. Years on the bench had given her a reputation for fairness, but also firmness, justice, delivered with little sentimentality. At the opposite table sat Carl Benton, the landlord. He was broad, but sagging in the middle, with thinning hair combed back too carefully. His face was ruddy, his jowls heavy. He had the kind of presence that once might have been intimidating, but today, under the fluorescent lights, he looked like a man cornered. His attorney, a thin fellow named Gregory Haskins, shuffled papers nervously, his glasses slipping every few minutes. Carl avoided Mason's eyes. When the proceedings began, Judge Collier's gavel cracked like thunder. "We are here to address alleged housing violations, failure to provide habitable conditions, and reports of unlawful attempts to change locks. Mr. Benton, do you understand the charges?" Carl's voice was gruff, but uncertain. "Yes, Your Honor." Tanner Brooks, the community lawyer who had helped Mason draft the legal letters, stepped forward. Tanner was in his late 40s with salt and pepper, hair that curled just slightly at the ends. His suit was worn but clean, his tie crooked in a way that gave him an approachable air. Tanner had been raised by a coal miner father who lost his health in unsafe housing, and it had left him with a lifelong conviction. Tenants deserve dignity. He presented photographs Mason had taken, peeling, walls lined with mold, rusted pipes, the illegal attempt to replace locks. He read aloud the cease and desist letter that Carl had ignored. Finally, he gestured toward Mason and Lily and the children, Your Honor, who were put at risk by neglect. Sarah Lindholm from CPS also testified with her auburn hair tied back and her glasses perched on her nose. She spoke with precise clarity. "We conducted 2 inspections. The first revealed unsafe living conditions, including mold, electrical hazards, and unsanitary circumstances. After community repair efforts, the home was brought into compliance. Mr. Hale has followed every directive, maintaining safe routines, ensuring supervision, and cooperating with CPS fully. Sarah closed her folder and added, "This case demonstrates how support and accountability can work together. I recommend closure of the file with community oversight remaining in place." Judge Collier leaned forward, fingers steepled, her gaze pinned Carl like a hawk. "Mr. Benton, housing law is not optional. You attempted to intimidate a tenant, neglected repairs, and endangered children. For this, the court imposes a fine of $5,000 payable within 30 days. You will also fund professional remediation of the property, mold removal, structural inspection, and plumbing repairs under city supervision. Failure will result in further sanctions." Carl's face sagged as if the words had knocked the breath from him. Then she turned to Mason. Her voice softened just slightly. "Mr. Hale, you have acted responsibly and consistently in your children's best interest. Full custodial rights remain with you. The CPS file will close, but community liaison will check in periodically. Continue as you have, and this family will thrive." Judge Collier's voice rang, steady, final. Mason exhaled, shoulders dropping as if he had just set down the heaviest pack of his life. Lily squeezed his hand tight, and Scout gave a single wag of his tail, as though he too recognized victory when he saw it. As for Shannon, the gavel fell hard. Neglect entered into the record, her name sealed into the state files, unfit for child supervision, barred from ever holding another license. The silence after was not grief, but release. Weeks passed. Winter thawed into early spring, and Birch Street seemed to breathe again. Each night, the porch light Mason's neighbors had helped install glowed across the cracked sidewalks. It was no longer just a bulb, it had become a beacon, a signal of safety, a promise that this house was not forgotten. Lily learned to ride her small blue bicycle in the driveway, wobbling forward with braids flying, shouting, "Daddy, look! No training wheels!" Scout trotted beside her like a seasoned sentinel, nosing her leg gently whenever she strayed too far. Max had begun toddling across the living room, his tiny fists gripping Scout's thick coat for balance. Each stumble was answered with the shepherd pressing close, steadying him, patient as stone. Neighbors stopped often to watch, hats tipping, their voices warm. "That's one good dog." Scout became more than Mason's companion, he became Birch Street's guardian. The mailman left biscuits at the gate. The bus driver honked and waved each morning. Children pedaled their bikes in circles under the glow of the porch light, Scout pacing like a shepherd for his flock. Pastor Helen even spoke of him on a Sunday morning. "Sometimes the Lord sends us protectors, not in armor, but in fur." Mason sat quietly in the pew that day, humbled. He had always known Scout was loyal, but now the whole town shared that truth. One cool night, after the children had gone to bed, Mason sat on the porch with Scout at his side. The stars burned clean above. The porch light hummed steadily, a faithful sentinel of its own. Mason spoke softly into the night. "We've come a long way, buddy. They're safe now. That's all that matters." Scout leaned his heavy head against Mason's knee, eyes half closed. For a moment, the world felt whole again. But then, from the far end of Birch Street came the low growl. Scout's ears pricked, body taut, muscles alive with warning. Mason followed his gaze. A figure lingered under the shadows of a broken street lamp, watching the house too long, too still. The porch light spilled golden across the yard, and Mason felt the old soldier's instinct rising. He realized then, some battles never end. Some dangers return when least expected. But with Scout at his side, he also knew this family would never face the darkness alone again. Because sometimes, the greatest battles are not fought overseas, but right here, in our homes, against neglect, fear, and the silence that tries to swallow us. And sometimes, in those darkest nights, God sends miracles, a soldier's strength, a community's compassion, and yes, even the unwavering eyes of a dog who will never stop standing guard. So let the porch light of Cedar Falls remind us all hope is not fragile. Hope is a flame. And if this story touched your heart, share it, so that others may carry its light into their own homes.